The rain over Shizuoka Prefecture fell in thick, unrelenting sheets, transforming the abandoned industrial district into a maze of slick concrete and rusted shadows. It was the kind of downpour that chilled the bone and washed away the scent of everything except the sharp, acrid sting of burnt ozone and sulfur. Izuku Midoriya crouched atop a crumbling gargoyle on the corner of a dilapidated warehouse, the emerald lightning of one for all crackling across his skin. His breath plumed in the freezing air, his teal eyes locked on the chaotic skirmish unfolding in the courtyard below. Deku! On your left, you damn nerd! The explosive roar of Katsuki Bakugo's voice cut through the torrential rain, accompanied by a blinding flash of orange and crimson. A concussive shockwave rippled through the courtyard, sending a trio of low-level thugs careening into a stack of rusted shipping containers. Bakugo launched himself backward, using a series of controlled bursts from his palms to navigate the slippery terrain, his face contorted in a familiar sneer of feral concentration. I see it, Kaken! Izuku yelled back, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through his veins. This was supposed to be a standard raid. A splinter faction of the Shai Hasaikai's remnants had been using this forgotten quadrant of the city to smuggle illegal support gear. The pro-hero agency Izuku was interning with had received the tip, and they had moved in quickly to secure the perimeter. But as was often the case in the life of a hero, the intelligence had been flawed. The smugglers weren't just armed with black market gear, they had a heavy hitter with them. A villain whose quirk had remained unregistered, chaotic, and wildly dangerous. Izuku's danger sense flared, a sharp, jagged needle of apprehension pressing into the base of his skull. He didn't hesitate. Pushing one for all to 8%, he launched himself off the stone gargoyle. The concrete fractured beneath his iron-soled boots, as he shot through the rain like a green comet. Below him, the courtyard was a mess of ice and fire. Shoto Todoroki was sliding across a massive glacier of his own creation, freezing the feet of escaping villains to the tarmac while simultaneously unleashing torrents of flame to corral them. Uraraka Ochako was bounding through the air, tapping debris and sending massive chunks of concrete floating upward to serve as improvised barricades. But Izuku's eyes were fixed on the center of the courtyard, where the leader of the smuggling ring stood cornered. The man was tall, gaunt, and desperate. His eyes were wide with the manic terror of a trapped animal. His hands were glowing with an unstable, swirling mass of violet and black energy that seemed to consume the light around it, distorting the falling rain into a spiral of defying gravity. Stay back! The villain shrieked, his voice cracking hysterically. I'll do it! I'll tear a hole right through this miserable city. Izuku landed softly in a crouch beside Todoroki, the green lightning illuminating the mist around them. Todoroki-kun, what's the status? He's erratic, Todoroki said evenly, though his eyes were narrowed in intense focus, his right side frosting over. Eraserhead is currently dealing with the snipers on the western roof. The villain claims his quirk is called dimensional banishment. He says it doesn't just destroy matter, it displaces it entirely. We haven't seen him use it offensively yet, but the energy output is massive. It's distorting the space around him. Izuku's mind immediately shifted into overdrive, the familiar rhythm of his tactical analysis taking hold. Dimensional displacement. If it acts like a black hole, getting close is suicide. But if it's a portal, where does it lead? Is there a limit to the mass he can displace? The energy is gathering at his palms, meaning it's a directional emitter type. If I can use Black Whip to bind his wrists before he fully charges. Deku! Stop muttering and move! Bakugo barked, landing heavily beside them, steam rising from his gauntlets. I'll blow his damn arms off, and you tie him up. Ready? Before Izuku could respond, Uraraka landed a few yards away, panting slightly. Guys, the civilians in the adjacent warehouse are completely evacuated. We have a clear field. Good, Izuku said, standing to his full height, the green power coalescing around him, shifting up to 20%. The power felt warm, a familiar, reassuring drumbeat echoing in his chest. Let's wrap this up safely. But the villain had heard Uraraka. His manic eyes locked onto her, realizing she was the most exhausted and vulnerable of the group. You think you've won? The villain screamed, the violet energy in his hands suddenly expanding rapidly, forming a swirling, crackling vortex that howled like a jet engine. I'm not going back to Tartarus. I'll take you all to the void with me. He thrust his hands forward, aiming directly at Uraraka. The world seemed to slow down. Izuku saw the massive beam of distorted, purple space tear through the air. It wasn't an explosion. It was a localized tear in reality, bending the rain and the light, moving with terrifying speed. Uraraka's eyes widened, her hands coming up in a futile defensive gesture. She didn't have time to dodge. Bakugo was already mid-leap in the opposite direction. Todoroki's ice wall was rising, but it was too slow. Izuku didn't think. He didn't analyze. His body simply moved. One for all surged to 45%. The sheer force of his acceleration cracked the sound barrier, shattering Todoroki's nearby ice and blowing the rain away in a perfect sphere. Black Whip! Izuku roared in his mind. Tendrils of shadowy, dark energy erupted from his arms, lashing out to wrap around Uraraka's waist. With a violent heave, he yanked her out of the trajectory of the blast, throwing her safely toward Todoroki. But in doing so, Izuku had placed himself directly in the center of the vortex's path. He crossed his arms in an X-guard, bracing for an impact that never came. There was no heat. There was no kinetic force. There was only an instantaneous, blinding flash of violet light, followed by a sensation of absolute, agonizing weightlessness. DKU. Bakugo's scream was the last thing Izuku heard before the sound was sucked away into a vacuum. The industrial courtyard, the rain, his friends, they all vanished in a kaleidoscope of twisting, unnatural colors. Izuku felt as though he were being pulled through a straw. His body was stretched, compressed, and spun in a centrifuge of chaotic energy. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to activate danger sense, trying to push one for all outward to stabilize himself, but the energy inside him flickered and sputtered, overwhelmed by the sheer dimensional pressure of the void. Stay conscious, he ordered himself, gritting his teeth against the nauseating vertigo. Breathe. Stay conscious. But the pressure was too much. The swirling colors faded into a deep, impenetrable black, and Izuku Midoriya lost his grip on reality, plunging into the dark. Heat. That was the first thing that registered. A suffocating, oppressive heat that felt like a wet blanket pressed against his skin. Izuku groaned, his eyelids fluttering. His head throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache, and his mouth tasted like copper and dirt. He tried to move his hand, but his fingers were buried deep in something soft, damp, and incredibly warm. Mud. He forced his eyes open, blinking away the blurriness. The sky above him wasn't the dark, rain-choked canopy of Shizuoka. It was a brilliant, blinding azure, dotted with massive, fluffy white clouds that seemed almost impossibly bright. The sun was beating down on him with a ferocity he had only ever experienced at the height of summer, yet the air smelled completely alien. It smelled of rich, overturned earth, decaying vegetation, and an overwhelming, fragrant perfume of colossal blooming flowers. Izuku sat up slowly, clutching his head as a wave of dizziness washed over him. Where am I? He rasped, his voice sounding entirely too small in the stillness of his surroundings. He looked down at himself. His Zeta Hero costume was scuffed and covered in thick, reddish-brown mud, but otherwise intact. His iron soles were caked with dirt, and his gauntlets were scratched, but he didn't seem to be severely injured. The pain in his head was fading, replaced by a growing, gnawing sense of profound disorientation. He pushed himself to his feet, wiping the mud from his face, and finally took a look at his surroundings. His breath hitched in his throat. He was standing in a jungle. But it wasn't a normal jungle. Everything was wrong. Everything was huge. To his left, a fern rose out of the ground. It wasn't a small, potted plant. It was a towering spire of green, its fronds stretching higher than a 3-story building. The leaves alone were the size of dining room tables, thick and waxy, dripping with condensation. To his right, the trunk of a tree shot into the sky like the pillar of a colossal temple. The bark was deeply grooved, the ridges large enough for a person to comfortably lie down in. Izuku craned his neck backward, trying to see the top of the canopy, but the branches disappeared into the blinding sunlight hundreds of feet above. What? Izuku whispered, his eyes wide, his analytical mind struggling to process the visual input. Is this a quirk? Did that villain shrink me? No, if I were shrunk, my mass would have changed, but gravity feels exactly the same. The dirt beneath my feet is proportional to my weight. So, the flora is giant? A buzzing sound, like the engine of a small aircraft, broke his train of thought. Izuku instinctively ducked, raising his arms defensively. A shadow passed over him, and he looked up to see an insect flying through the clearing. It looked like a dragonfly, with iridescent blue and green wings that caught the sunlight. Except this dragonfly was the size of a golden eagle. Izuku watched in stunned silence as the massive insect darted gracefully through the giant ferns, snapping up something that looked like a flying squirrel before disappearing into the dense foliage. Okay, Izuku, calm down, he muttered to himself, his hands trembling slightly as he began to pace back and forth in the mud, his thumb instinctively finding his chin in his trademark thinking pose. Hypothesis 1. The villain's quirk was an illusion type, and I'm trapped in a mental construct. Counterpoint. The sensory details are too vivid. The heat, the humidity, the smell of the mud. Illusions rarely possess this level of environmental complexity unless it's a quirk on the level of an absolute master, which that smuggler didn't seem to be. Hypothesis 2. Size manipulation. I was shrunk and teleported to a greenhouse or a terrarium. But that doesn't explain the sky, the sun, or the specific prehistoric morphology of that dragonfly. It resembled a meganeura, an extinct insect from the Carboniferous period. Hypothesis 3. Izuku swallowed hard, his heart hammering against his ribs. The villain's quirk was exactly what he said it was. Dimensional displacement. He didn't just teleport me across Japan, he punched a hole through space-time. I'm either millions of years in the past, or I'm in an entirely different dimension where the ecosystem evolved on a massive scale. The sheer weight of the realization threatened to crush him. He was alone. Uraraka, Todoroki, Bakugo, All Might, his mother, they were all gone. He had no idea how to get back, or if getting back was even mathematically possible. No, Izuku mentally slapped himself, his jaw setting with determination. Panic is the enemy. A hero assesses the situation, survives, and finds a way to win. First priority. Gather information. Second priority, find shelter and a water source. Third priority, establish a way home. He took a deep breath, letting the power of one for all thrum to life beneath his skin. The emerald lightning danced across his green suit, illuminating the dark shadows of the giant ferns. The power was still there, completely unaffected by the dimensional shift. He had his strength. He was a hero. He could do this. Suddenly danger sense screamed. It wasn't a minor prickle of unease. It was a violent, agonizing spike of pure terror that felt like a lightning bolt striking the inside of his skull. Izuku gasped, dropping to one knee and clutching his head. Before he could recover, the ground beneath him trembled. Thud. It was a heavy, rhythmic impact. Like a boulder being dropped from a crane. The mud vibrated, sending ripples through a small puddle near Izuku's boots. Thud. The sound was closer this time. The giant ferns rustled aggressively, the massive fronds parting as something immense moved through the dense jungle. The air grew thick, the ambient sounds of the jungle, the buzzing insects, the distant calls of strange birds, falling completely, deathly silent. Izuku didn't wait. Drawing on one for all at 10%, he bolted. He scrambled toward the base of the nearest colossal tree, diving into the deep crevices between its exposed, serpentine roots. The hollow was dark, damp, and smelled heavily of moss, but it provided a perfect vantage point to observe the clearing without being seen. He pressed his back against the rough wood, killing the green glow of his quirk, holding his breath. Thud. The clearing parted. Izuku's breath caught in his throat, his eyes widening to their absolute limit. Stepping into the sunlight was a monster torn straight from the pages of a history book, only magnified and more terrifying than any artist's rendering. It was a Tyrannosaurus Rex, but calling it a mere dinosaur felt like an insult to the sheer majesty and terror of the creature. It stood easily 40 feet tall at the hip, a towering mountain of muscle, bone, and scale. Its skin was a mottled pattern of deep emerald green and dark, earthy browns, allowing it to blend seamlessly with the jungle canopy. Thick, armored scuts ran down its spine, culminating in a massive, heavy tail that swept back and forth with deliberate, calculated grace. Its head was easily the size of a delivery truck, armed with jaws that could snap a steel girder in half. Rows of jagged, serrated teeth gleamed in the sunlight, some as long as Izuku's forearm. But it wasn't just the size that terrified Izuku, it was the scars. The beast's hide was crisscrossed with old, faded battle wounds, claw marks, burns, and jagged lines that spoke of a lifetime of violent conflict. Izuku pressed himself harder against the tree root, his heart threatening to hammer its way out of his chest. A T-Rex. An actual, living T-Rex. The apex predator of the late Cretaceous period. If it sees me, I'm dead. Even with One for All, fighting a creature with that much mass and bite force, I'd have to use 100% just to stun it, and I'd shatter my arms doing it. The giant theropod stopped in the center of the clearing, right where Izuku had been standing moments before. It lowered its massive head, its immense, reptilian eyes scanning the mud. The eyes were striking, not the dull, unthinking orbs of a mindless lizard, but a piercing, intelligent amber. The pupil dilated, contracting as it stared at the disturbed mud where Izuku had been pacing. Then, the beast inhaled. A deep, rumbling sound resonated in its chest, a low-frequency vibration that Izuku could feel rattling in his very teeth. The T-Rex was sniffing the air. It has a sense of smell sharper than a bloodhound, Izuku realized with mounting dread. It can smell me. It knows I'm here. The T-Rex slowly lifted its head, turning its massive snout directly toward the roots of the tree where Izuku was hiding. For a terrifying second, Izuku made direct eye contact with the apex predator. The amber eye locked onto his hiding spot. The beast let out a low, guttural hiss, its jaws parting slightly to reveal the terrifying array of teeth. It took a step forward, the ground shaking beneath its weight. It found me. I have no choice. I have to fight. Izuku's eyes hardened. The panic faded, replaced by the cool, calculated focus of a hero cornered. He couldn't afford to hold back. If he didn't strike first and strike hard, he would be swallowed whole. Green lightning exploded from Izuku's body, illuminating the dark hollow of the tree roots. He pushed One for All to 20%, his muscles coiling like steel springs. With a fierce yell, Izuku launched himself out of the root system. He cleared the distance between the tree and the T-Rex in a microsecond, leaping high into the air, aiming directly for the creature's massive snout. St. Louis! Izuku roared, pulling his right leg back for a devastating, mid-air roundhouse kick. He expected the T-Rex to roar. He expected it to snap its jaws and try to bite him out of the sky. He did not expect what happened next. The terrifying, 40-foot apex predator let out a sharp, undignified gasp. It violently flinched backward, its tiny, two-fingered arms coming up in a surprisingly defensive, almost human gesture of shock. Izuku, completely thrown off by the beast's reaction, aborted his attack mid-air. He twisted his body, aborting the smash, and landed heavily in the mud, skidding to a halt a few yards away from the dinosaur's massive, clawed feet. He stayed in a crouch, his fists raised, green electricity crackling around him. "Stay back!" Izuku shouted, though he knew the beast couldn't understand him. "I don't want to hurt you, but I will defend myself." The T-Rex didn't attack. Instead, it sat down. It literally dropped its massive hindquarters onto the jungle floor with a heavy thud, the ground shaking under the impact. It blinked its giant amber eyes, staring down at the tiny, glowing green human in the mud. Then, the T-Rex did the impossible. It reached behind its massive back. For the first time, Izuku noticed that the beast was wearing a harness. Strapped to its side was an enormous, leather satchel, roughly the size of a studio apartment, heavily stitched and adorned with complex, metal buckles. Using its surprisingly dexterous, albeit tiny, two-fingered hands, the T-Rex fumbled with a buckle, popped the flap of the satchel open, and reached inside. Izuku stood frozen in absolute disbelief. What is it doing? Does it have tools? The T-Rex pulled out an object. It was a pair of spectacles. They were impossibly huge, fashioned from thick, polished brass wire, with lenses the size of manhole covers. The T-Rex carefully brought the spectacles to its face and perched them delicately on the bridge of its scaly snout. The frames rested neatly behind its ear holes. The beast leaned forward, the giant brass-rimmed glasses magnifying its amber eyes, giving the terrifying apex predator an incredibly bizarre, scholarly appearance. It peered at Izuku, scrutinizing him the way a scientist might examine a newly discovered bacterium under a microscope. The T-Rex blinked, and then it opened its jaws and spoke. By the Great Comet. The voice was deep, resonant, and distinctly feminine. It rumbled with a bass that vibrated in Izuku's chest, but the enunciation was flawless, refined, and in perfect Japanese. What in the world are you? Izuku's brain stopped working. The green lightning of One for All sputtered and died out entirely. His arms dropped to his sides. His jaw went slack, hanging open as he stared up at the giant, bespectacled dinosaur. You. Izuku stammered, his voice cracking violently. You spoke. You're wearing glasses. And a bag. And you spoke Japanese. The T-Rex leaned back slightly, her massive brow furrowing in confusion. Of course I am speaking. Though I am unfamiliar with the term Japanese. I am speaking the common tongue of the apex, and yes, these are my reading glasses. My close-range vision has been deteriorating for the last decade. She tilted her massive head, peering at him over the rim of the lenses. But that hardly addresses the anomaly here. You are remarkable. You possess bilateral symmetry, bipedal locomotion, yet you lack a tail for counterbalance. Your skin is entirely devoid of scales, feathers, or defensive scuts. You are completely furless, save for the peculiar green tuft on your cranium. The giant dinosaur reached into her satchel again. Izuku flinched, preparing for an attack, but the T-Rex merely pulled out a book. It was a notebook. A colossal, leather-bound notebook, filled with giant pages. In her other tiny hand she held a massive stick of graphite, sharpened to a point. Fascinating, the T-Rex muttered, her voice taking on a rapid, highly focused cadence that sounded eerily familiar to Izuku. The morphological structure suggests a mammalian origin, yet mammals in this sector never exceed the size of a standard field shrew. You are easily 20 times that size. Furthermore, you were emitting a visible, bioelectric aura just moments ago. An ancestral blessing? A quirk of genetics? If so, the energy output for a creature of your mass is utterly unprecedented. She began scribbling furiously in her giant notebook with her graphite stick, muttering under her breath the entire time. No claws. Blunt dentition. Forward-facing eyes indicating predatory lineage, yet the jaw structure suggests an omnivorous diet. And the garments? Highly synthetic, woven fibers. Clearly manufactured. A tool using mammalian anomaly. This could rewrite the entire phylogenetic tree of the Cenozoic epoch. Izuku stood in the mud, his mouth still hanging open. She's muttering, Izuku realized, a hysterical bubble of laughter threatening to rise in his throat. I was teleported to a prehistoric death world, nearly got eaten by a T-Rex, and she's a giant, reptilian nerd. Excuse me. Izuku yelled, cupping his hands around his mouth to ensure his tiny voice reached her ears high above. The T-Rex stopped writing. She looked down at him, her amber eyes wide behind her glasses. Apologies. I have a terrible habit of verbalizing my hypotheses when I am faced with a fascinating subject. It is considered quite rude in polite society. She gently closed her massive notebook and placed it back into her satchel. She then lowered her massive head until she was eye level with Izuku. Even lowered, her head was taller than he was, and he could feel the hot, humid gust of her breath ruffling his hair. It smelled faintly of peppermint and raw meat. Allow me to introduce myself properly, she said, her tone warm and professional. I am Professor Rexa. I hold the chair of evolutionary biology at Uror University in Mesozoic City, and you, little one, are the most extraordinary creature I have encountered in my 42 years of life. What is your species? Izuku swallowed hard. The sheer absurdity of the situation was finally breaking through his panic, leaving him in a state of hyper-focused calm. He was dealing with a sentient, educated, polite Tyrannosaurus Rex. In the world of quirks, he had seen men with spraken heads and heroes who looked like washing machines. A talking dinosaur wasn't that much of a stretch. I'm a human, Izuku said, bowing politely out of pure instinct. My name is Izuku Midoriya. I'm a hero in training from UA High School. I'm from Earth. Japan. Human, Professor Rexa repeated, rolling the word around in her massive mouth. Man. Fascinating. I have never heard of this Japan territory. Is it located on the Pangaean supercontinent, or perhaps near the Laurasian coast? It's an island nation, Izuku replied, rubbing the back of his neck. But Professor Rexa, I don't think we're from the same Earth. Where I come from, humans are the dominant species. Mammals evolved, and dinosaurs, like your kind, went extinct 65 million years ago. An asteroid hit the planet. Rexa stared at him for a long, heavy moment. The jungle remained silent, save for the distant buzzing of the giant dragonfly. Then she gasped, a sound of pure, unadulterated academic shock. The Chicxulub anomaly! She exclaimed, her massive hands coming up to adjust her glasses. By the Great Comet, you're from a divergent timeline. A theoretical parallel reality. In our history, the great asteroid you speak of, the Chicxulub meteor, missed our planet by a mere cosmic fraction. It passed through our atmosphere, causing a meteor shower, but it did not strike. We survived. We evolved. She pulled her notebook out again, scribbling at a frantic pace. A reality where the meteor struck. The global ash cloud would have caused a mass extinction, wiping out all large-scale reptilian life. Only the smallest, burrowing creatures, early mammals, would have survived the nuclear winter, and over millions of years, without the apex predators to keep them in check, those mammals grew, evolved, and achieved sapience. Oh, this is magnificent. Wait until the Apex Council hears of this. Izuku couldn't help it. His own notebook, which he kept in a waterproof pouch on his utility belt, was suddenly in his hands. He clicked his pen, his eyes shining with matching academic fervor. So, because the asteroid missed, the evolutionary pressure remained on the dinosaurs. Izuku muttered rapidly, writing in his notebook. The theropods maintained their position at the top of the food chain, but natural selection favored higher brain function to outmaneuver prey. You developed agriculture, tool use, society. But wait, what about the quirks? The bioelectric energy you mentioned earlier. In my world, humans suddenly developed superpowers called quirks a few centuries ago. Do you have them here? Professor Rexa leaned down, her eyes sparkling with delight as she watched the tiny humans scribbling in a tiny notebook. We call them ancestral blessings, Midoriya Izuku. Or simply quirks, in the common slang, she explained warmly. About 3 million years ago, a genetic mutation began sweeping through the dominant species, T-Rexes, Triceratops, Pteranodons. We began developing extraordinary abilities outside the laws of standard physics. Pyrokinesis, gravity manipulation, enhanced durability. It accelerated our civilization exponentially. Izuku's pen flew across the page. Incredible. The quark singularity theory applies cross-species in a divergent evolutionary timeline. If the genetic building blocks for quarks were present in the primordial DNA of Earth, then regardless of whether mammals or reptiles became the dominant sapient species, the quark phenomenon was an inevitable evolutionary milestone. Exactly. Rexa roared, though it was a roar of joy, not aggression. The sound sent a flock of giant, feathered Archaeopteryx bursting from the canopy above. Your deductive reasoning is astounding for a creature with such a small cranial cavity. Izuku blushed, scratching his cheek with his pen. Ah, thank you. Though in my world, my brain is considered normal-sized. Rexa chuckled, a deep, rumbling sound that shook the mud beneath Izuku's feet. I mean no offense, little Midoriya. To me, you are the size of a Compsognathus. But clearly, your intellect is vast, and that energy you displayed. She leaned closer, her voice lowering. That green lightning. That was a quirk, was it not? Izuku nodded, closing his notebook. Yes. It's called One for All. It grants me superhuman strength, speed, and agility. I saw, Rexa murmured, a note of awe in her voice. You leapt 40 feet into the air from a standstill. For a creature with your bone density and muscle mass, the physics of such a feat are staggering. You are a microscopic powerhouse. Izuku smiled, but the reality of his situation suddenly came crashing back down on him. He wasn't just on a field trip. He was lost in a world of giant, superpowered dinosaurs. He had no food, no shelter, and no way home. His shoulders slumped, and he looked down at his muddy boots. Professor, I don't know how I got here. A villain with a space-time quirk attacked me. I need to find a way back to my world. My friends, my mother, they must be terrified. They probably think I'm dead. Rex's expression softened, the ferocious apex predator adopting a look of deep, maternal sympathy. She reached out with one tiny, leathery finger and gently patted the top of Izuku's green hair. The single finger was as thick as Izuku's entire torso, but the touch was incredibly delicate. Do not despair, little Midoriya, she said softly. You are not alone. You have made first contact with the Apex Society, and we are not a savage people. We are scientists, heroes, and citizens. She stood to her full, terrifying height, adjusting her satchel. I was out here in the wild zone conducting botanical field research, but my expedition is officially concluded, she announced. I am taking you with me back to Mesozoic City. We will present you to the Apex Council. They govern our society and oversee all Pro-Rex activities. If there is a way to traverse the dimensional rift and return you to your world, the Council will have the resources to find it. Izuku's eyes widened. Pro-Rex? You have pro-heroes here? Of course, Rexa smiled, showing off her rows of terrifying, sword-like teeth. Where there are quirks, there are those who use them for villainy. And where there are villains, there must be heroes to protect the innocent. Come along, little human. We have a long walk ahead of us. Izuku felt a surge of hope in his chest. Heroes existed here. And where there were heroes, there was justice, help, and a way forward. Thank you, Professor Rexa, Izuku said, bowing deeply. I accept your help. Excellent. However, Rexa looked down at him, tapping her chin thoughtfully. The walk back to the city limits is approximately 40 of your miles. Given your minuscule stride length, we will not arrive before nightfall, and the nocturnal predators in this zone are not as civilized as I am. Before Izuku could ask what she meant, Rexa bent down, sliding her massive hands into the mud beneath him. Whoa! Hey! Izuku yelped as he was suddenly scooped up into the air. He scrambled for balance, finding himself sitting in the cupped palms of the giant T-Rex. He was lifted 40 feet into the air, the jungle floor falling away beneath him. He grabbed onto the edge of her scaly thumb to steady himself, his heart pounding at the sudden altitude. Apologies for the indignity, Rexa rumbled, holding her hands close to her chest to keep him secure. But this is the most efficient mode of transport. Hold on tight, Midoriya Izuku. Welcome to Earth Cretaceous. With a powerful stride, the giant T-Rex began to walk. Every step was smooth but massive, eating up the distance of the jungle at an incredible pace. Izuku sat in the palm of her hand, feeling the warmth of her scales, looking out over the sprawling, prehistoric world before him. As they crested a large ridge in the jungle, the trees finally broke, and Izuku saw it. His breath left him in a rush. Spread out across a massive valley was a city. But it was a city built for titans. The skyscrapers were monolithic structures of stone, steel, and glass, stretching thousands of feet into the air, designed to accommodate creatures the size of buildings. Massive highways crisscrossed the sky, where enormous, flatbed vehicles the size of aircraft carriers moved smoothly along. In the distance, Izuku could see winged pteranodons soaring between the towers, carrying what looked like giant briefcases in their talons. It was a modern metropolis, scaled up to an impossible degree, populated entirely by the rulers of a bygone age. Izuku Midoriya, the boy who had once been quirkless, who had fought villains, psychos, and tyrants in his own world, tightened his grip on the giant dinosaur's thumb. A small, excited smile broke across his face. He was the only human in a world of T-Rexes. He was tiny, vulnerable, and a million miles from home. But I'm still Deku, he thought, the green spark of one for all flickering warmly in his chest. And I'm going to learn everything I can about this world. The journey had just begun. The journey out of the wild zone was an exercise in sensory overload, a continuous stream of impossible physics and biology that kept Izuku Midoriya's analytical mind spinning in circles. He sat cross-legged in the cupped, leathery palms of Professor Rexa, acting as a tiny, green passenger aboard a 40-foot-tall, bipedal transport. Every step the giant Tyrannosaurus took was a masterclass in biomechanical efficiency. Despite her colossal mass, easily tipping the scales at 8 or 9 tons, by Izuku's frantic mental calculations, her footfalls were surprisingly smooth. The massive muscles in her legs and hips acted as heavy-duty shock absorbers, minimizing the vertical jostle. Still, for Izuku, it felt like riding in the back of an off-road jeep hurtling over a rocky trail. He had to keep one hand securely gripped on the edge of her scaly thumb to keep from bouncing out of her palm. Fascinating, Izuku muttered, his notebook resting open on his lap. He was gripping his pen so tightly his knuckles were white, frantically scribbling notes, despite the turbulence. The counterbalance provided by the tail is extraordinary. In standard bipedal mammals, the spine supports the weight vertically. But here, the body acts like a seesaw balanced on the fulcrum of the hips. The heavy tail offsets the weight of the massive cranium and torso, allowing for rapid forward momentum without the risk of toppling forward. And her stamina. We've been walking for an hour at a pace of at least 30 miles per hour, and her respiration rate has barely elevated. Is it a highly efficient avian-style respiratory system with air sacs? You have a remarkably loud internal monologue, Midoriya Izuku. Rex's voice rumbled down from above, vibrating through the scales of her hands and straight into Izuku's bones. Izuku flinched, snapping his notebook shut and blushing furiously. Sorry, Professor Rexa. I do that when I'm nervous or excited. And right now, I'm incredibly both. Rexa let out a soft, chuffing sound of amusement, a warm gust of peppermint-scented air blowing over Izuku. Do not apologize. Intellectual curiosity is the hallmark of a civilized mind, and to answer your query, yes, our respiratory systems are highly augmented compared to our primitive ancestors. Our lungs are supplemented by an extensive system of air sacs that extend into our very bones, allowing for unidirectional airflow. It is how we sustain our massive bodies and power our ancestral blessings. Izuku's eyes practically turned to stars. Unidirectional airflow. Just like modern birds on my Earth. It's convergent evolution on a macro scale. Indeed, Rexa agreed, her golden eyes fixed on the horizon. Prepare yourself, little human. We are approaching the outer perimeter of Mesozoic City. The dense canopy of the prehistoric jungle began to thin, giving way to cleared land. Izuku stood up, carefully balancing against the professor's fingers, and peered over the edge of her hand. What he saw took his breath away. It wasn't just a city. It was a monument to titanic engineering. A massive, sweeping wall of reinforced ferroconcrete curved along the edge of the valley, standing at least 200 feet tall. It looked like the kind of seawall used to hold back tsunamis in Japan. But here, it was merely a municipal boundary. Giant, arched gates, wide enough to sail a battleship through, were spaced evenly along the wall. As Rexa carried him through the nearest gate, Izuku finally grasped the true scale of the society he had stumbled into. The primary thoroughfare they stepped onto was an expanse of black asphalt wider than an airport runway. The pavement was deeply textured, grooved to provide traction for massive, three-toed feet. Towering monolithic buildings framed the street, constructed from a blend of sleek glass, polished steel, and heavy stone. Everything was designed to accommodate the sheer bulk and height of apex predators. The doorways of the shops and residential complexes were gaping archways 40 to 50 feet high. Traffic moved along the center of the avenue. There were vehicles, but they were unlike anything Izuku had ever seen. They were colossal, open-air platforms hovering inches above the ground, driven by anti-gravity technology, or perhaps localized quirks. The vehicles were roughly the size of military tanks, transporting giant pallets of goods or carrying groups of T-Rexes who were too elderly or injured to walk. And then there were the citizens. Thousands of Tyrannosaurus Rexes filled the streets. It was a bustling, deafening sea of scales, tails, and teeth. They came in an astonishing variety of colors and mutations. Izuku saw T-Rexes with scales of crimson red, deep sapphire, and sandy yellow. Some had elaborate crests of brightly colored feathers running down their necks. Others possessed heavily armored skuts resembling ankylosaurus plating. They wore clothing, too, though it was highly functional and tailored to their unique anatomy. Massive harnesses, vests, and sashes woven from thick, durable fibers crisscrossed their enormous torsos. Some wore heavy, metallic bracers on their tiny forearms, while others carried gargantuan bags slung over their shoulders. The noise was absolute chaos. The hum of the anti-gravity vehicles was drowned out by the thundering cascade of thousands of multi-ton footsteps. The low, resonant hum of T-Rex conversation sounded like a continuous earthquake, a symphony of deep bass rumbles, sharp clicks, and guttural chuffs. It's incredible," Izuku whispered, overwhelmed. He felt smaller than he ever had in his entire life. He was a speck of dust in a canyon of giants. As Rexa walked down the pedestrian side of the street, Izuku peered into the giant storefronts. They passed what appeared to be a restaurant. The outdoor patio featured enormous, reinforced stone tables. A dark blue T-Rex wearing a pinstriped vest was sitting at one, using a colossal, two-pronged metal fork to eat a slab of cooked meat. Izuku did the mental math and realized the steak the dinosaur was casually slicing into was roughly the size and weight of a minivan. Next door was an apparel shop. Massive swathes of fabric, large enough to act as circus tents, hung in the windows. Izuku noticed the intricate tailoring required to leave massive, reinforced holes for their heavy tails. "Keep yourself low in my palms, Midoriya," Rexa advised softly, her tone shifting from academic to protective. "The general public is not accustomed to seeing anything as peculiar as you. I do not wish to incite a panic, nor do I want someone to mistake you for a stray vermin." Izuku swallowed hard and sat back down, trying to make himself as small as possible behind the wall of Rexa's fingers. But it was too late. Rexa was a prominent figure, and her arrival in the city from a field expedition was already drawing eyes. More than that, the tiny, brightly colored speck of green and red sitting in her hands was impossible for the sharp-eyed predators to miss. "Hey, look at the professor!" A booming voice echoed from across the street. Izuku peeked through the gap in Rexa's fingers to see a bright orange T-Rex with a spiked tail pointing a stubby claw in their direction. "What's she carrying? Is that a new species of synapsid?" Another T-Rex, this one sporting a pale green hide and a delivery satchel, paused to stare. "It's completely hairless. And look at its weird, tiny flat face. It doesn't have a snout." A younger, smaller T-Rex, only about 15 feet tall, whined, tugging on its mother's harness. "Can we keep it, Mom? It looks so squishy and pathetic." Izuku felt a bead of sweat roll down his forehead. "Squishy and pathetic? I mean, relatively speaking, I suppose I look like a naked mole rat to them." A crowd began to form, slowing Rex's progress. Giant, amber and yellow eyes peered down at Izuku from all angles. The sheer predatory aura radiating from the crowd was suffocating. Millions of years of evolutionary instinct screamed at Izuku that he was prey, surrounded by a pack of the deadliest hunters nature had ever designed. His danger sense was humming in the back of his skull like a low-grade migraine, constantly analyzing the ambient threat of the massive teeth and crushing weight surrounding him. "Step aside, please. Official university business. Stand clear," Rexa announced. Her voice didn't rise to a shout, but the deep, authoritative bass of her tone commanded immediate respect. She let out a short, sharp hiss, and a wave of low-level telekinetic energy rippled from her snout, gently but firmly pushing the crowd back a few feet. "Telekinesis?" Izuku noted, his eyes widening. "So that's her quirk. That explains how she handles delicate research equipment with such small forelimbs." "Professor Rexa!" The crowd parted as two massive figures stepped forward. They were imposing, even by the standards of the giant citizens. Both T-Rexes wore thick, matte black armor plating over their chests and heads, adorned with a silver, star-shaped insignia. Police! Or the equivalent of them, Izuku realized. "Officers!" Rexa greeted them, bowing her head slightly. The lead officer, a heavily scarred dark gray Rex, leaned down to inspect Rex's hands. His nostrils flared, taking in Izuku's scent. Izuku held his breath, staring directly into an eye the size of a beach ball. "We received reports of a biological anomaly entering the city limits," the officer rumbled, his voice strictly professional, though his eyes betrayed deep suspicion. "You appear to be in possession of an undocumented, unclassified organism. State its origin." "I discovered him in the wild zone, officer," Rexa replied calmly. "He possesses sapience, high-level intelligence, and the capacity for complex speech. He claims to be from a divergent dimensional timeline. The second officer snorted, a blast of hot air that nearly knocked Izuku over. A dimensional traveler? Looks more like a mutated, furless rodent to me. It's a health hazard, Professor. We don't know what kind of parasites or diseases it might be harboring. We have protocols for invasive species. He is not a parasite, Rexa said, her voice hardening with a protective edge. He is a guest. And he is in my custody. I am taking him directly to the Apex Council to report this incident. The lead officer narrowed his eyes, scrutinizing Izuku. Izuku, realizing this was a crucial moment for first impressions, stood up as tall as he could, brushed the mud off his hero costume, and bowed deeply. Greetings, officers! Izuku called out, projecting his voice from his diaphragm so it would carry over the ambient noise of the city. My name is Izuku Midoriya. I mean your city no harm, and I deeply respect your authority. I am fully willing to cooperate with the council. The two officers recoiled slightly, their heavy brows shooting up in unison. By the ancestors, it speaks our tongue. The gray officer muttered, visibly unsettled. And with the formal dialect of the central provinces, no less. He is highly educated, Rexa stated proudly, though she had only known Izuku for an hour. Now, if you will excuse us, the council expects my report. The officers exchanged a wary glance but slowly stepped aside. We will escort you, Professor. An anomaly of this nature cannot be allowed to wander unmonitored. If it attempts to bite, escape, or reproduce, we will be forced to terminate it. Izuku gulped, nodding vigorously to assure them he had no intention of doing any of those things. The Apex Council headquarters was situated in the very center of Mesozoic City. If the surrounding buildings were skyscrapers, this structure was a man-made mountain, built from a seamless integration of polished black obsidian and reinforced titanium. The building resembled a colossal ziggurat. Wide, sweeping ramps spiraled up the exterior, leading to a massive, open-air dome at the summit. Rexa, flanked by the two heavily armed police escorts, climbed the ramps with practiced ease. Izuku sat quietly in her hands, his awe slowly being replaced by a gnawing anxiety. This is their government, Izuku thought. The leaders of an apex predator society. If they decide I'm a threat, or if they decide I'm just an animal to be dissected, I might have to fight my way out. No, that's the worst-case scenario. I have to use diplomacy. I have to prove I'm a hero, not a monster. They passed through a series of towering security checkpoints. The guards here possessed terrifying quirks. Izuku saw one guard with eyes that emitted sweeping laser grids, and another whose scales shifted into mirrored camouflage, rendering him nearly invisible. Finally, they entered the central chamber. The room was vast, circular, and illuminated by a massive skylight that cast a dramatic beam of sunlight onto the center floor. The walls were lined with ancient, monumental carvings depicting the evolutionary history of the T-Rex, their triumph over the harsh environment, the awakening of quirks, and the founding of the city. In the center of the room sat a massive, semicircular desk carved from a single, unbroken piece of white marble. Behind the desk sat three figures. The Apex Council. Izuku felt the sheer weight of their presence the moment Rexa stepped into the room. These weren't just politicians. They were warriors who had survived and conquered. The T-Rex in the center was ancient. His scales were a faded, dusty white, crisscrossed with deep ravines of wrinkles and scars. One of his eyes was milky and blind, but the other burned with a piercing, intimidating intellect. He wore a regal crimson sash heavily decorated with medals. To his right sat a sleek, dark purple female Rex, adorned in minimalist, modern silver jewelry. She possessed an air of ruthless efficiency, her sharp eyes scanning every millimeter of Izuku's tiny form. To the elder's left was the most physically terrifying of the three, a massive, bulky Rex with scales as black as coal. His jaw was heavily undershot, revealing rows of teeth that looked like shattered glass. Smoke continuously plumed from his nostrils. Professor Rexa, the elder Rex spoke. His voice was like grinding stones, filling the chamber without him needing to raise it. You have returned early from your botanical survey, and I see you have brought a souvenir. Rexa stepped forward, lowering her hands gently to a heavy stone pedestal in the center of the room. Izuku stepped off her palms, finding himself standing on the flat, cold stone, completely exposed beneath the scrutinizing gaze of the three giant rulers. Grand Elder Tyron, Rexa said, bowing deeply. Councilwoman Vex. General Cinder. I present to you an unprecedented biological and dimensional anomaly. His name is Izuku Midoriya. He is a human from a divergent timeline. General Cinder, the massive black T-Rex, let out a harsh, barking laugh that rattled Izuku's teeth. A dimensional traveler? Rexa, have you been eating fermented cycad leaves again? Look at it. It's a hairless rodent in a brightly colored wrapping. It looks like a child's chew toy. With all due respect, General, I assure you he is highly intelligent. Rexa countered smoothly. Councilwoman Vex leaned forward, her purple scales gleaming in the sunlight. Intelligence can be mimicked. True sapience is proven. Little creature, do you understand my words? Izuku took a deep breath. He channeled everything he had learned from All Might, from Aizawa, from Ida. He stood up straight, puffed out his chest, and projected his voice with absolute clarity. I understand you perfectly, Councilwoman Vex, Izuku said, bowing respectfully to each of them. My name is Izuku Midoriya. In my world, I am a hero in training. I was struck by a villain's space-time displacement quirk during a battle, which forcibly transported me to your dimension. I mean your society no harm, and I ask for your assistance in finding a way back to my home. Silence blanketed the chamber. For a long moment, the only sound was the faint crackle of smoke emerging from General Cinder's nostrils. Then, the Grand Elder leaned forward, his single good eye narrowing. It speaks with the poise of a diplomat, yet possesses the physical mass of a hatchling's morning meal. Fascinating. It's a trick, Cinder growled, standing up abruptly. His massive frame cast a shadow over the entire pedestal. It's a bioweapon engineered by the rival raptor clans in the southern hemisphere. They created a tiny, unassuming parasite to infiltrate our city, bypass our security grids, and spread disease or sabotage our infrastructure. I say we crush it immediately. Izuku's danger sense spiked sharply. Cinder wasn't making an idle threat. The general's muscles were already tensing, preparing to smash the pedestal to dust. General, stop! Rexa shouted, stepping between the pedestal and the massive black Rex. He is not a weapon! He is a victim of a dimensional accident. Move, Rexa! Cinder commanded, his throat glowing with a dull, fiery orange light. I am tasked with the security of Mesozoic City. I will not allow an unclassified parasite to live within our walls. Wait! Izuku yelled, throwing his hands out. He didn't want to fight the government, but he wasn't going to let himself be squashed either. He pushed one for all to 5%, the green lightning sparking lightly across his skin. I'm not a parasite. I have a quirk of my own. I'm a hero. The green electricity caught the council's attention. Cinder paused, his fiery throat dimming slightly. A quirk? Councilwoman Vex murmured, her eyes widening. An organism of that size possessing an ancestral blessing? The energy density required for such a display without causing cellular combustion in a body that small. She looked at Tyron. Elder, if this creature is indeed from a divergent reality, its biological makeup could provide invaluable data to our medical and scientific sectors. Grand Elder Tyron raised a single, massive hand, silencing the room. He stared down at Izuku for a long time. You claim to be a hero, Izuku Midoriya, Tyron rumbled. In our society, a hero is not merely a title. It is an apex predator who uses their strength to shield the weak, maintain order, and enforce the will of the council. You lack size. You lack armor. You lack natural weaponry. What could a creature of your stature possibly offer in the way of heroism? Izuku looked up at the giant, ancient dinosaur. He thought of All Might, facing down the sludge villain. He thought of his own broken bones, his relentless drive to save just one person. In my world, Izuku said, his voice steady and unwavering, being a hero isn't about how big you are, or how sharp your teeth are. It's about the willingness to put your life on the line for others. It's about moving when everyone else is frozen. Size doesn't dictate courage. Tyron's eye glinted with something that looked remarkably like respect. Eloquent words, Tyron noted. But words do not stop collapsing buildings, nor do they subdue violent criminals. He sat back down, steepling his massive fingers. Here is the Council's ruling. You are an anomaly. Your existence here poses an unknown variable. General Cinder is correct to be cautious, but Councilwoman Vex and Professor Rexa are right to see the scientific value in your survival. Therefore, you will not be terminated. Izuku let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. However, Tyron continued, his voice echoing with absolute authority. You cannot be allowed to roam freely. You are a complete unknown. You will be placed under strict, 24-hour observation. You will be assigned to the Aurora Hero Academy, under the direct supervision of the faculty, where your quirk and your psychological profile will be intensely monitored. If you prove to be a threat, or a spy, you will be destroyed. If you prove to be what you say you are, we will allow our temporal researchers to look into the possibility of a dimensional return. Izuku bowed deeply. Thank you, Grand Elder. I accept your terms. General Cinder snorted, a cloud of black smoke enveloping the ceiling. You are putting a mouse in a school of dragons, Tyron. He won't survive the week. The students will step on him by accident. Then it will be a very short observation period. Tyron replied coldly. Meeting adjourned. Rexa, take the anomaly to, boom. The entire ziggurat shook violently. Izuku lost his footing, tumbling backward onto the stone pedestal. Rexa quickly caught the pedestal with her telekinesis, stabilizing it before Izuku could roll off the edge. What was that? Vex demanded, standing up and bracing her hands on the marble desk. Another explosion rocked the building, this one closer. The massive skylight above them rattled, a spiderweb of cracks appearing in the thick glass. The heavy stone doors to the council chamber burst open. A heavily wounded police officer, bleeding from a nasty gash across his snout, stumbled into the room. Council! The officer gasped, clutching his side. Code Red! A rogue villain has breached the central plaza. It's a mutated theropod. High-tier quirk. Our outer perimeter forces have been completely decimated. Cinder let out a furious roar, the fire in his throat fully igniting. Who dares attack the capital in broad daylight? He calls himself Ignis Rex. The officer coughed. His quirk, it's some kind of hypercombustible plasma. He's breathing purple fire. The ambient temperature in the plaza is melting the asphalt. Izuku's heart skipped a beat. Purple fire? Wide-scale destruction. It sounds like a villain with a highly volatile emitter quirk. And he's attacking a crowded public plaza. Deploy the Prorex units immediately! Tyron commanded, slamming his fist onto the desk. Evacuate the civilians within a 10-block radius. Cinder, take command of the vanguard. With pleasure. Cinder growled, turning toward the doors with terrifying speed. Professor Rexa! Vex ordered. Take the human to the subterranean bunkers. He is fragile and highly valuable. Do not let him be incinerated. Rexa scooped Izuku off the pedestal. Understood. Hold on, Midoriya. Rexa didn't run toward the main doors. Instead, she bolted toward a side exit that led down a wide, spiraling ramp. Professor, wait! Izuku yelled over the blaring sound of emergency sirens echoing through the halls. We have to go to the plaza. Are you mad? Rexa shouted back, her massive legs pounding against the stone floor. You are the size of a hors d'oeuvre. That villain is breathing plasma. It would vaporize you instantly, but there are civilians out there. Izuku argued, his hands gripping her fingers tightly. The officer said the plaza was crowded. Evacuation takes time, especially for creatures of your size. If the panic sets in, people will be crushed in the stampede before the fire even reaches them. That is the job of the Prorexes. Rexa insisted, her tone brokering no argument. They reached a massive balcony overlooking the front of the council headquarters. Through the giant archway, Izuku could see the chaos unfolding below. It was a nightmare. The sprawling plaza, once a beautiful testament to prehistoric architecture, was an inferno. Vehicles were overturned, burning fiercely. Thousands of terrified T-Rexes were stampeding toward the side streets, their massive bodies colliding with one another in a frantic bid for survival. And in the center of the plaza stood the villain. He was a monstrous specimen, even by T-Rex standards. He was heavily mutated, his scales a sickly ash-gray, bulging with unnatural muscle mass. From his mouth poured a terrifying, swirling torrent of violet flame. It wasn't normal fire. It looked almost liquid, splashing against the stone buildings and melting the masonry upon impact. Several police officers were trying to subdue him, firing tranquilizer darts from heavy shoulder-mounted cannons, but the purple fire simply incinerated the projectiles mid-air. With a roar that shook the very air, the villain whipped his massive tail, smashing a beautiful stone fountain to rubble, sending massive chunks of rock flying into the fleeing crowd. Izuku's danger sense screamed. He tracked the trajectory of the falling debris. A chunk of solid marble, roughly the size of a house, was hurtling directly toward a family of brightly colored T-Rexes who had been knocked over in the stampede. A mother was desperately trying to cover her young child with her body, but they were trapped. The Pro-Rexes were too far away. The police were pinned down by the fire. Rexa was running in the opposite direction. Nobody is going to make it in time, Izuku realized. The fear melted away. The awe of the giant city vanished. The logic of his tiny size was completely erased by the overwhelming, singular instinct that defined his very soul. Someone needs help. Professor Rexa, Izuku said, his voice terrifyingly calm. I'm sorry. Sorry for what? Before Rexa could finish her sentence, green lightning exploded from Izuku's body. He pushed one for all to 10%, utilizing shoot style. With a concussive blast of air, Izuku leapt out of Rexa's hands. Midoriya! Rexa shrieked in horror, watching the tiny human plummet from the balcony toward the blazing, chaotic plaza below. Izuku ignored the drop. He focused entirely on the falling marble boulder and the terrified family beneath it. The wind roared in his ears as he fell, calculating the angle, the distance, and the required kinetic force. They think size is everything, Izuku thought, his eyes narrowing as the green power surged through his legs. They think mass equals power. I'll show them, the concentrated power of humanity. He twisted in midair, bringing his iron-soled boot back, aiming directly for the falling house-sized chunk of debris. The villain roared, breathing another torrent of purple fire. The crowd screamed. The mother T-Rex squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the crushing impact. And then, a tiny, brilliant streak of green lightning intersected the sky. The air in the central plaza of Mesozoic City tasted of sulfur and melted tar. For the average citizen, a Tyrannosaurus Rex was a creature of immense pride. They were the undisputed apex predators of a world where nature had refused to hit the reset button. They were born with bone-crushing jaws, thick, armor-like scales, and the genetic legacy of millions of years of unbroken supremacy. To be a citizen of the apex society was to know, fundamentally, that you were at the top of the food chain. But fear, as it turned out, was the great equalizer. When faced with a force that defied even their colossal biology, the primal instinct to flee overrode all pride. Cerulia was one such citizen. She was a young mother with scales the color of a twilight ocean, adorned with a crest of elegant, silver feathers running down the nape of her neck. Usually, she walked the streets with her head held high, carrying her 3-year-old hatchling, Taro, securely in a woven fabric sling against her chest. Today was supposed to be a simple trip to the plaza's central market to purchase a fresh slab of hadrosaur flank for dinner. Instead, it had become a descent into a nightmare. The plaza was an inferno. The villain, a monstrously mutated theropod who called himself Ignis Rex, was a walking cataclysm. His quirk, a hypercombustible, liquid-like purple plasma, was not merely burning the city, it was dissolving it. The plasma clung to everything it touched, eating through reinforced ferroconcrete, melting the chassis of the giant anti-gravity vehicles, and turning the beautiful, prehistoric statues of the plaza into bubbling slag. Cerulia had tripped in the initial stampede. When Ignis Rex had unleashed his first volley of plasma, the panic had been instantaneous. Thousands of multi-ton dinosaurs had scrambled for the narrow exit avenues. In the chaos, a heavily armored Ankylosaurus mutant had accidentally clipped Cerulia's leg with his swinging tail, sending her crashing to the grooved asphalt. She had managed to twist her massive body mid-fall, taking the brunt of the impact on her shoulder to protect little Taro and his sling, but the damage was done. Her right ankle was severely sprained, perhaps broken. She could not stand. She could not run. "Mommy, it's hot!" Taro whimpered, his tiny, high-pitched voice barely audible over the roaring flames and the deafening screams of the crowd. He buried his small, blue snout into his mother's chest, his amber eyes wide with absolute terror. I know, my little tooth, I know. Cerulia gasped, wrapping her small forelimbs around him as best she could. She tried to push herself backward, her good legs scraping uselessly against the melting pavement. Keep your eyes closed. The Prorexes will be here soon. General Cinder will save us. But as Cerulia looked up, her heart plummeted into her stomach. The police forces were entirely pinned down. They were huddled behind the melting remains of a massive stone barricade, their tranquilizer cannons rendered completely useless by the ambient heat of the plasma, which vaporized the darts the moment they left the barrels. General Cinder had indeed arrived on the scene, bursting from the Apex Council headquarters with a terrifying roar, but even the great general was struggling. Cinder's quirk allowed him to generate and manipulate immense thermal energy, but Ignis Rex's plasma wasn't just hot, it was chemically volatile and physically heavy, like burning napalm. Every time Cinder tried to close the distance, Ignis Rex would spew a tidal wave of the purple liquid, forcing the general to retreat or risk having his own black armor plating melted down to the bone. You call yourselves Apex? Ignis Rex bellowed, his voice distorted and wet, echoing off the towering ziggurat of the council building. His ash-gray scales were bulging with unnatural, tumor-like muscles. He whipped his heavy tail, shattering a line of decorative pillars. You are weak! Fattened by peace and coddled by this pathetic society! I am the true evolution! I am the fire that will cleanse this city! He inhaled deeply, his chest expanding to impossible proportions. The spaces between his scales glowed with a sickly, blinding violet light. He wasn't aiming at General Cinder anymore. He was aiming at the monumental, multi-ton marble fountain in the center of the plaza, directly above where Cerulia and Taro were trapped. No! General Cinder roared, recognizing the villain's intent. Squadron, concentrated fire on his lower jaw! Disrupt his exhalation! It was too late. Ignis Rex unleashed a concentrated beam of purple plasma directly into the base of the massive fountain. The ancient marble didn't just break, it exploded. The superheated plasma flash boiled the water inside the fountain's reservoir, creating a massive steam explosion that shattered the stone structure from the inside out. Chunks of marble, some the size of transport trucks, were launched into the air. Cerulia looked up. Time seemed to slow to a crawl. A massive chunk of the fountain's intricately carved base, easily weighing 40 tons, was tumbling through the smoke-filled air. It was hurtling directly toward them. There was no time for General Cinder to reach them. There was no time for a rescue. Cerulia let out a heartbreaking, guttural cry. She curled her massive body inward, curling her long tail around herself, acting as a biological shield over her terrified child. She squeezed her eyes shut and prayed to the ancestors that her armored scuds would be enough to spare Taro, even if she herself was crushed. High above the plaza, free-falling from the balcony of the Apex Council headquarters, Izuku Midoriya saw it all. The wind whipped violently against his face, tearing at his green hair and flattening the fabric of his Zeta Hero costume against his skin. The heat rising from the plaza was stifling, like falling into a furnace, but Izuku barely registered it. His danger sense was screaming, painting the trajectory of the falling marble boulder in sharp, jagged lines of red in his mind's eye. Distance to target, 300 meters, Izuku's mind raced, processing variables with the speed of a supercomputer. Descent velocity is increasing at 9.8 meters per second squared. The boulder's mass is immense, but its structural integrity has been compromised by the thermal shock of the villain's plasma. Izuku squeezed his eyes shut for a fraction of a second, feeling the familiar, warm spark of One for All deep within his core. It wasn't just a quirk, it was a legacy. It was the accumulated will of generations of heroes, passed down to protect those who could not protect themselves. It didn't matter that he was in an alternate dimension. It didn't matter that the people below him were giant, bipedal reptiles. Someone is in trouble, Izuku thought, his teal eyes snapping open, blazing with fierce determination. And I am a hero. One for all, full cowling! Izuku shouted into the rushing wind. Emerald lightning erupted around his body, accompanied by the sharp, crackling sound of high-voltage electricity. The glowing red veins of power illuminated his skin as he dialed the output precisely to 8%. It was a level his body could maintain comfortably without tearing his own muscles apart, yet it provided a level of kinetic force that completely defied the laws of biological physics. I need to intercept the boulder before it reaches terminal velocity, but if I hit it too hard with a blunt strike, the shrapnel will pepper the civilians below. I need a sweeping strike to redirect the kinetic energy horizontally. Izuku shifted his mass mid-air, angling his body into a steep dive. He streamlined his form, accelerating his fall, rocketing past the panicked gaze of Professor Rexa, who was still screaming his name from the balcony far above. Below, Cerulia braced for the crushing impact. The shadow of the massive marble chunk fell over her, but the impact never came. Instead, there was a sound like a thunderclap directly above her head. Boom! The shockwave was immense. It hit the ground like a physical wall of air, blowing away the lingering purple smoke and instantly extinguishing the secondary fires burning in a 50-foot radius. The sheer force of the air pressure pressed Cerulia flat against the asphalt, her scales rattling. She opened her eyes, gasping for breath, and looked up. The 40-ton marble boulder was gone. In its place was a cloud of fine, white dust, drifting harmlessly to the ground like snow. The massive chunk of stone had been entirely pulverized into powder midair, and slowly descending through the cloud of white dust, suspended for a brief moment in the grip of gravity, was a tiny figure. Cerulia blinked, her amber eyes straining to focus on the impossible sight. It was the creature that the rumor mill had been whispering about all morning, the furless anomaly Professor Rexa had brought from the wild zone. But right now, it didn't look like a fragile rodent. It was wrapped in a terrifying aura of green electricity. Its right leg was extended in a picture-perfect martial arts high kick, the iron-soled boots smoking faintly from the friction of the impact. The creature's eyes were glowing with a fierce, uncompromising light. Izuku landed softly on the asphalt mere inches from Cerulia's snout. He touched down in a low crouch, the green lightning dancing across the pavement, grounding itself in the stone. He didn't look back at the massive dinosaur behind him. He kept his eyes locked firmly on Ignis Rex across the plaza. "Are you and your child all right, ma'am?" Izuku asked. His voice was small, but carried an absolute, unwavering calm that cut through the chaos of the plaza like a knife. Cerulia was too stunned to speak. She just stared at the tiny, bipedal creature, her jaw slightly slack. Little Taro peeked out from the sling, letting out a soft, confused chirp as he looked at the glowing green boy who had just shattered a boulder the size of a house. Across the plaza, the fighting had ground to a sudden, jarring halt. Ignis Rex, who had been preparing to unleash another volley of plasma, paused. He blinked his milky, ash-colored eyes, staring through the clearing smoke at the tiny figure standing between him and his intended victims. General Cinder, positioned behind a melted police cruiser, slowly lowered his massive arms, his jaw dropping open, completely oblivious to the smoke spilling from his own nostrils. "What, in the name of the ancestors, was that?" Cinder muttered, his deep voice echoing in the sudden quiet. He had felt the shockwave from 100 yards away. It hadn't been a quirk-generated explosion, it had been pure, concentrated kinetic force. Ignis Rex let out a low, rumbling growl, wiping a string of purple saliva from his jagged teeth. "What is this? A new toy from the council? A tiny machine?" He took a heavy, earth-shaking step forward, peering down at Izuku. "Get out of my way, little bug, before I melt you into the pavement." Izuku stood up to his full height. Compared to the 40-foot monster standing before him, Izuku was microscopic. He barely reached the height of the dinosaur's ankle, but Izuku's posture didn't betray a single ounce of fear. He squared his shoulders, raised his fists into a guarded boxing stance, and glared up at the villain. "You're attacking innocent civilians!" Izuku yelled, his voice echoing across the ruined plaza. "You're using your quirk to cause terror and destruction. I don't care how big you are. I won't let you take another step." Ignis Rex stared at the tiny human for a moment. Then, he threw his massive head back and laughed. It was a horrible, wet sound that sounded like boiling mud. "You won't let me?" the villain mocked, looking around at the stunned Pro-Rexes as if sharing a joke. "I am Ignis Rex. I am the pinnacle of thermal mutation. I can melt a steel vault in 3 seconds. And you, a little squishy morsel, think you can stop me?" Izuku didn't respond to the taunt. His mind was already at work, muttering under his breath at a speed that left the nearby dinosaurs completely bewildered. The villain's quirk is a highly volatile plasma emitter. The plasma is generated in the esophageal tract and expelled through the mouth. However, looking at the localized burns around his own lips, his body isn't entirely immune to the heat he produces. Furthermore, there's a delay of approximately 4.2 seconds between his major blasts, indicating a required refractory period to gather the necessary chemical components in his throat. His size grants him incredible raw strength and durability, but his center of gravity is entirely reliant on the counterbalance of his tail. If I can disrupt his equilibrium and strike during his refractory window. Hey! Did you break, little toy? Ignis Rex sneered, leaning down, his massive jaws opening wide. The sickening purple glow began to build deep within his throat, radiating a wave of blistering heat that made Izuku's skin prickle. Let's see how you handle 1,000 degrees, kid! Get out of there! General Cinder finally snapped out of his shock, roaring at the top of his lungs. He's going to vaporize you, one for all, full cowling! Izuku declared, his voice cutting through the rising roar of the villain's plasma. The green lightning flared brighter, shifting from 8% up to 15%. The air around Izuku began to vibrate. The sheer density of the power gathering within his small frame cracked the asphalt beneath his boots. Ignis Rex lunged forward, unleashing a massive, roaring torrent of violet plasma directly at Izuku. The beam was 30 feet wide, a devastating wave of liquid fire designed to incinerate everything in its path. Cerulia screamed, turning her head away. But Izuku didn't flinch. Just as the wall of plasma was about to consume him, Izuku moved. He didn't just run, he vanished. To the eyes of the giant T-Rexes watching, it looked as though the tiny human had simply teleported. A sharp crack of displaced air echoed through the plaza, followed by a streak of green light that zipped diagonally out of the plasma's path. The purple fire slammed into the empty pavement, melting a crater 10 feet deep into the ground, but Izuku was already gone. Ignis Rex blinked, cutting off his plasma breath, his massive head swiveling in confusion. What? Where did it go? Up here! Ignis Rex jerked his head upward. Izuku was suspended in the air, directly adjacent to the villain's massive left knee. He had used the tremendous leg strength of one for all to launch himself vertically, completely bypassing the villain's line of sight. You little pest! Ignis Rex roared, swinging his massive, two-fingered hand in a vicious backhand meant to swat Izuku out of the sky like a fly. The hand was the size of a small car, moving with enough force to shatter a building. But to Izuku, who was accustomed to dodging high-speed explosions from Bakugo and precision attacks from Shigaraki, the giant limb moved in slow motion. Izuku didn't just dodge. He used the attack to his advantage. As the massive scaly hand swept toward him, Izuku twisted in midair, bringing his boots up. He planted his feet squarely against the villain's incoming knuckles. Using the villain's own momentum against him, Izuku pushed off, firing himself even higher into the air like a bullet ricocheting off a steel plate. He's too big to take down with a barrage of normal strikes, Izuku analyzed, soaring past the villain's chest, feeling the intense heat radiating from the beast's scales. His mass absorbs kinetic energy like a sponge. I need a single, concentrated strike to a vital point. The jaw. If I can deliver enough concussive force to the mandible, the resulting shockwave will rattle his brain inside his skull, inducing immediate unconsciousness. Ignis Rex was furious. He snapped his massive jaws, trying to bite Izuku out of the air, but the tiny hero was too fast, too erratic. Izuku zigzagged through the air, bounding off falling debris, using the architecture of the nearby melted buildings to parkour his way higher and higher. Stand still! Ignis Rex bellowed, his throat glowing purple once more. He tilted his head back, aiming to blast Izuku out of the sky. Now! Izuku thought, his eyes narrowing as danger sense flared. He's exposing his throat and jaw. Izuku reached the apex of his jump, hanging in the air a full 60 feet above the plaza floor. He was a tiny, glowing speck against the brilliant blue sky. He took a deep breath, feeling the phantom presence of the previous wielders of One for All standing behind him. He thought of All Might's smiling face. He thought of the terrified mother and child huddled below. The green lightning surged violently, the output spiking up to 20%. The power pooled heavily into his right leg, the red veins pulsing with unimaginable kinetic potential. Ignis Rex opened his jaws, the purple plasma beginning to bubble over his teeth. Die! Izuku entered freefall. He didn't just fall with gravity. He actively propelled himself downward, using a burst of compressed air from a flick of his fingers to accelerate his descent. He rocketed toward the villain's upturned face like a green meteor. I am a hero! Izuku roared, his voice echoing with a resonance that seemed far too large for his small body. He extended his right leg, aligning his entire body to deliver maximum rotational torque. St. Louis! Ignis Rex's eyes widened, finally realizing the sheer, terrifying density of the energy plummeting toward him. He tried to close his jaws, tried to turn his massive head away, but it was too late. Smayas! Izuku's iron-soled boot connected squarely with the underside of Ignis Rex's massive, armored jaw. For a fraction of a millisecond, the world went completely silent. It was a silence born of pure, overwhelming pressure, as the air itself was compressed to its absolute breaking point. Then, the physics caught up. Kaboom! The sound was apocalyptic. It was louder than any thunderclap, louder than a bomb. A perfect, visible ring of white condensed air exploded outward from the point of impact, expanding rapidly across the plaza. The sheer atmospheric pressure of the smash shattered every glass window within a 5-block radius. The nearby street lamps bent backward, and the lingering purple fires were instantly snuffed out, suffocated by the vacuum of the shockwave. The kinetic energy transferred entirely into Ignis Rex's skull. The villain's massive jaw snapped shut with a sickening crack, shattering several of his own jagged teeth. The force of the blow didn't just snap his head back, it lifted his entire, 7-ton body off the ground. For a surreal, terrifying moment, the 40-foot apex predator was entirely airborne, his massive legs dangling uselessly as his momentum was violently reversed by a creature the size of a doll. Ignis Rex's milky eyes rolled completely back into his skull. The bioelectric light of his plasma quirk flickered, sputtered, and died out instantly. Gravity reclaimed the beast. Ignis Rex crashed down onto the grooved asphalt. The impact created a miniature earthquake, shaking the very foundations of the surrounding ziggurats. His massive, unconscious body bounced once, crushing a melted anti-gravity vehicle, before skidding to a halt and coming to a rest in the center of the plaza. He didn't twitch. He didn't breathe fire. He was out cold. Izuku, having delivered the devastating blow, executed a perfect backflip in midair to bleed off his remaining momentum. He fell gracefully, landing softly on the snout of the unconscious villain. The green lightning faded, retreating beneath Izuku's skin. He slowly stood up, adjusting his red utility belt, and brushed a speck of dust off his shoulder. He took a deep breath, exhaling a small puff of air, his chest heaving slightly from the exertion. Then, he looked around the plaza. It was silent, dead, absolute, pin-drop silence. The roaring fires were gone. The screaming had stopped. The only sound was the distant wail of a police siren and the gentle rustling of the wind blowing through the shattered windows. Thousands of Tyrannosaurus Rexes, citizens, police officers, and pro-heroes alike, were frozen in place. They were staring at the center of the plaza, their giant amber, yellow, and green eyes wide with an emotion that bordered on religious shock. They looked at the 7-ton, heavily mutated, plasma-breathing titan lying completely unconscious on the ground, and then they looked at the tiny, hairless, green-clad creature standing victoriously atop its snout. General Cinder stood slowly, stepping out from behind his melted barricade. The smoke had stopped pluming from his nose. His jaw was hanging open so far it nearly touched his heavily armored chest. He rubbed his giant eyes with his tiny forelimbs, as if trying to clear a hallucination. By the great comet! Cinder whispered, his deep voice carrying through the silent plaza. It knocked him out. With a single strike, up on the balcony of the Apex Council headquarters, Professor Rexa was gripping the stone railing so tightly her claws were carving deep grooves into the marble. Her glasses were askew on her snout. I told you! Rexa breathed, a massive, predatory grin slowly spreading across her face. He is a microscopic powerhouse! Behind her, Grand Elder Tyron and Councilwoman Vex had stepped out onto the balcony. Tyron's single good eye was locked onto Izuku. The ancient ruler, who had seen centuries of warfare and the evolution of the greatest quirks in history, stood entirely motionless. The kinetic output, Vex murmured, her analytical mind struggling to process the math. It violates every known law of biomechanics. For a creature of that mass to generate that level of force, his cellular structures should have disintegrated. Yet he is unharmed. He is not a parasite, Tyrant said softly, a deep rumble of profound respect resonating in his chest. He is a warrior. Down in the plaza, Izuku realized everyone was staring at him. He suddenly felt incredibly self-conscious. He hopped down from the villain's snout, landing lightly on the pavement, and immediately turned his attention back to the family he had saved. He jogged over to Cerulia, who was still laying on the ground, clutching her child. "Excuse me, ma'am," Izuku said, his voice returning to its usual polite, slightly nervous cadence, completely contrasting the godlike feat he had just performed. "Are you injured? I noticed you favoring your right leg when you fell. I believe the Prorex medical teams will be able to assist you momentarily." Cerulia slowly uncurled her body. She looked at Izuku, her massive eyes filled with a mixture of awe and profound gratitude. You saved us," Cerulia whispered. She gently reached out with her snout, lowering her massive head until it was level with Izuku. It was a gesture of deep, submissive respect in Apex culture. "The boulder, it would have crushed my hatchling. You shattered it. You defeated the Firebringer." Little Taro peeked out from the sling again. He didn't look terrified anymore. He looked at Izuku with pure, unadulterated starry-eyed wonder. "You're really strong, Mr. Tiny Green Man," Taro chirped, his tail wagging excitedly against his mother's chest. "You went whoosh and then smash. Are you a new Prorex?" Izuku couldn't help but smile, a warm, genuine grin breaking across his face. He reached up and gently patted the giant, scaly snout of the mother Rex, before offering a thumbs up to the child. "I'm just a hero passing through," Izuku said kindly. "But yes, I'm always here to help." Suddenly, a massive shadow fell over them. Izuku turned to see General Cinder looming over him. The black-scaled T-Rex was terrifying up close. He was a mountain of muscle and scar tissue, radiating a heat that felt like an open oven door. His teeth were bared, but not in aggression. General Cinder looked down at Izuku. He looked at the unconscious villain. Then, he looked back at Izuku. Slowly, deliberately, the great general dropped to one knee. The impact cracked the pavement beneath him. He bowed his massive, armored head toward the tiny human. "I misjudged you, anomaly," Cinder rumbled, his voice filled with newfound reverence. "I called you a rodent. I called you a parasite. I was a fool blinded by scale and mass. You possess the spirit and the striking power of a true apex. I, General Cinder of the Vanguard, offer you my apologies and my deepest respect." Izuku panicked slightly, waving his hands frantically. "Oh! No, please, General Cinder, sir. You don't need to bow. You were just doing your job to protect the city. It's completely understandable to be suspicious of an unknown entity." Cinder raised his head, a gruff chuckle vibrating in his chest. "Humble, too. A rare trait among those with powerful ancestral blessings. What did you say your name was, warrior?" "Izuku Midoriya," Izuku replied, standing at attention. "Hero name, Deku." "Deku," Cinder repeated, tasting the alien word. He stood up to his full height, turning to address the crowd and the gathering police forces. "Secure the villain with heavy tungsten restraints," Cinder barked, his authoritative presence returning instantly. "Deploy the cooling foam to neutralize any remaining plasma. Medical teams, attend to the wounded civilians. And someone get a transport platform over here for our guest." The plaza erupted into organized chaos. The police officers, now freed from the fear of the plasma, moved with ruthless efficiency. Massive transport vehicles descended from the sky, deploying heavy restraints that locked Ignis Rex's jaws shut and bound his massive legs. Paramedics, T-Rexes wearing white vests with red crosses, rushed into the plaza carrying giant medical kits. One of them immediately attended to Cerulia, using a quirk that secreted a rapid healing gel to soothe her sprained ankle. Through it all, Izuku stood in the center of the plaza, out of the way, watching the massive society work together. It was beautiful in a bizarre, prehistoric way. They were giant, terrifying monsters, yet they cared for each other, protected each other, and functioned just like his society back home. Midoriya! Izuku looked up to see Professor Rexa rushing toward him, followed closely by a floating platform carrying Grand Elder Tyron and Councilwoman Vex. Rexa looked incredibly frazzled, her glasses completely askew. She stopped in front of him, dropping her massive head down so she was eye level. "Are you insane?" Rexa hissed, though there was no real anger in her voice, only relief. "You leapt from a 200-foot balcony! You engaged a Class A villain in direct combat! You could have been incinerated." "I'm sorry, Professor," Izuku said sheepishly, rubbing the back of his neck. "But I saw the civilian in danger. My body just moved on its own before I could think about it." Grand Elder Tyron stepped off his platform, his heavy footsteps echoing as he approached Izuku. The ancient Rex looked down at the tiny human, his single eye calculating. "Your body moved on its own to save a stranger," Tyron noted softly. "That is the very definition of heroism in our ancient texts. Izuku Midoriya, you have proven my initial assessment to be drastically inadequate." Izuku bowed politely. "I just did what any hero would do, Grand Elder. Perhaps in your world," Tyron said. "But in ours, power is usually synonymous with size. You have shattered that paradigm today, you have saved innocent lives, and you have subdued a threat that paralyzed our vanguard." Councilwoman Vex leaned forward, her purple scales glinting. "We were going to place you under strict observation to ensure you were not a threat, but after this display, it is clear that simply locking you in a laboratory would be a criminal waste of your potential." "We uphold our initial ruling," Tyron declared. "You will be enrolled in the Aurora Hero Academy. But not as a prisoner, Midoriya. You will attend as a transfer student. You will train alongside the next generation of our Pro-Rexes. We will provide you with lodging, resources, and our top temporal scientists will begin researching the dimensional rift that brought you here." Izuku's eyes widened. He was going to a dinosaur hero school. He was going to be a student in a world of giant apex predators. The sheer absurdity of it was overwhelming, but underneath the shock, the thrill of a new challenge ignited his spirit. "I accept," Izuku said, a determined smile on his face. "I'll learn everything I can, and I'll prove that a human can stand side by side with the apex." "I have no doubt that you will," Tyron rumbled. As the medical teams finished clearing the plaza and Ignis Rex was hauled away on a massive transport platform, the citizens began to gather around the perimeter. They weren't running anymore. They were watching the tiny green hero who had saved them. Suddenly, from the back of a medical transport, little Taro popped his head up. "Thank you, Deku!" The tiny T-Rex cheered, waving his stubby forelimbs. The cheer seemed to break the dam. A roar of approval began to ripple through the crowd. It started small, a low rumble of bass, but it quickly escalated. Thousands of Tyrannosaurus Rexes threw their massive heads back and unleashed a deafening, unified roar of victory and gratitude into the sky. The sound was so powerful it physically shook Izuku's bones. Izuku stood in the center of the cheering giants, looking up at the azure sky. He was millions of years removed from his own evolutionary timeline. He was trapped in a dimension where he was the smallest, squishiest creature on the planet. But as he raised his fist into the air, returning the cheer of the prehistoric crowd, Izuku Midoriya knew one thing for certain. He was going to be the greatest hero this world had ever seen.